Welcome, John, to Metaladium Pages. It's a great pleasure to talk with you about Hand of Kalliach and this new album. Cool, that's interesting name.
Yeah,
Corey, a very
Corey
difficult
reckon. Yeah,
record.
absolutely. It's a brutal one for sure. Yeah, we're not kind to our reviewers, especially if English isn't your first language. Then the Gaelic will be that much harder as well. Yeah. But thanks very much for having me on, Javier. Much appreciated.
Corey, I'm obviously more related to the metal one in general. So we'll start by asking, so how was the band been during the last 3 years? Because your first album, Sandheim, was released in 2021.
That's it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's been a pretty wild ride over the past few years for sure. We had done a little EP before then just to kind of test the waters that we kind of just did as a bit of a experimental piece that we weren't even really intending to release, just a 5-track one. But yeah, Samhain was absolutely our first serious effort at pulling together a comprehensive album, and this was very much an extension of that sort of sound and that sort of feel, tying in a lot of the mythology and a lot of the same sort of ethereal vocals onto a melodeath sort of bass.
Hmm, okay, okay. Well, one thing about this Hand of Kalliach is the band starts at the beginning of the pandemic. So, what motivates you to create a band in at that time?
Yeah, well, fair question. I mean, it's just me and Sophie, and Sophie's my wife. So we're married, and we were just living at home with the kids, and we were in lockdown in the UK, so no one was able to go out anywhere for the pandemic for basically a year. And we were going slightly stir crazy. Every day was the same, and I'd not played music properly for probably about 15 years, to be totally honest. And Soph hadn't played for a similar amount of time, but we still had our instruments kicking around. So we thought, hey, you know what? Let's give it a bash and just come up with some fun stuff to do together in the evenings. And we talked about doing a sort of different mix of folk metal than maybe what you might normally be more familiar with in that sort of genre, where we'd have a lot more I guess sort of serious sounding and a lot more with the folk elements in the background rather than in the forefront, as seems to be the sort of case with a lot of more traditional type folk metal. So we really want to take a lot of the rhythms and the scales and the patterns that you might hear on folk instruments like Scottish violins or accordions or bagpipes even, and take those scales and rhythms and tunes, but put them on an electric guitar and make them really sound a lot more aggressive. So you still get quite a lot of the energy coming through, but it's all very much within the context of melodic death metal sort of bass. And then as we progressed with the writing with our last album and with this one, Soph really came into her own with her singing, and we really found what seems to be quite a good groove where her vocals on the sort of floaty, almost fragile, ethereal sort of sound really complement and match the more rough vocals that I do myself. And so it was quite an evolution, I guess, from kind of a weird homegrown project into something that we're now 2 albums deep in and trying to spin up a live band for.
Okay, amazing history about this. Well, the creation of the hand of Kalliach. Well, now talking about the three things because
Sure.
Kalliach is a very unusual name for a band. Kalliach. Then this first album, Sandheim, and now COVID Reckon. That is a curious names for an album
Yeah.
and a band. So who came with the idea to put Hand of Kalliach? And who is Kalliach? I think it's from the mythological aspect from your side.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, that's totally right. So the Kalliach is an old sort of ancient sort of pagan witch god of winter, all sort of pre-Christianity times in the Scottish sort of West. And she was responsible for ushering in winter. And some of the mythology goes that she lives at the bottom of a whirlpool, which is called the Corrie Vrecken, hence the name of the album, which is a very real place. It's actually the third biggest whirlpool in the world, but it's not commonly known, and it sits between some of the islands on the west coast of Scotland. My mum's family is all from the west coast of Scotland, from those islands, and that was very much the sort of area where I spent a lot of time in my youth growing up. And you would hear the occasional sort of fun legend story, but I'd never really dug into it more deeply until I was kind of into my 30s. And sort of there's so much on the mythology side of things, and so many interesting fables and tales. But it's just not particularly widely known, even in Scotland. So I guess one thing we've really enjoyed doing with this album, the last album, is really diving into that mythology a lot more. And you touched on Samhain, and Samhain is the actual precursor to what became Halloween as the festival at the end of October on the 31st. That was originally called Samhain, which was the sort of first day or the beginning of winter, which in the Kalliach mythology, she would rise from the whirlpool on the eve of Samhain and wash her cloak in the waters of the whirlpool, bringing it to sort of a boil, and it would leave the cloak eventually white, and she would then cast that out over the lands where it kind of lands as snow, and that commences winter from there. So that seemed like a good tie-in, I guess, with our first album, was to sort of start off at Samhain with the reign of the Kalliach figure, and then with the Corey Vrechen really exploring that more, I guess, intense sort of churning maelstrom that is that whirlpool once it really gets going in the middle of winter as well. And so I guess that's kind of the explanation behind the mythology going through the names.
Oh, interesting. Oh, interesting to know. A lot of things happen. Well, you mentioning, well, since well, you released your first album, Sandheim, through your, independently, so by yourself at that time, and now you are entered one of the well-known labels as Prosthetic Records. Is it? So how was your enter to Prosthetic Records? Who came first? You put in contact with them, or they will put in contact with you? Who knows?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So we actually were with a small underground label for Samhain, Trepanation Recordings, but that was mostly just to do the CDs and the tapes, and some T-shirts and stuff like that. But the label owner there, Dan, he's a really, really nice guy, and he'd been super supportive of us. He thought our sound was great and has just been really supportive of us all the way through. We came back to him with our new stuff, all recorded and mixed and ready to go, and said, "Okay, here you go, Dan. What do you reckon? Would you be keen to do another round?" Because he actually also did the tapes and CDs for our very first EP, just that 5-track one, and there was only like 50 CDs ever made of it. But he was happy to put us out there. So he'd always been really supportive and really good to us. And he's such a good guy. He turned around and said, "Look, guys, I think this has got legs. I think this has got big potential. I think you should try and shop this around some of the bigger labels and actually see, because they could give you more reach than I could do," which was an extremely kind thing for him to say, and some encouragement for us to go and do exactly that. So Sophie and I sat down, we made a list of 3 labels that we would love to work with. Prosthetic was at the top of the list because we've loved a lot of the stuff that they've done historically and indeed more recent times. I think 3 of my favorite albums from last year were all on Prosthetic, and that they also seem to be kind of keen on some of the weirder underground sort of sounds that still have like quite a modern, I guess, interesting sort of bass to them. So we dropped them a line just with the initial tracks, and we couldn't believe it. They came back in like 2 hours after we'd sent the email, and it was a guy, Steve, over there who looks after A&R. And it turned out that Steve had actually been following us and bought one of the first ever of those 50 CDs for the EP that had been made. So he's in the States. He picked one up off following Trepanation's underground distro, and had been quietly like following us ever since then. He said, "Look, I love the album. I loved your last album. Would love to make something work." He said they do things by committee in prosthetics, so he had to go and share it around with the rest of the team there and see if they were happy. But I think they came back even that day to say that everyone was happy, the owners were happy, they were all keen, and I think we were like signed with the contract done and dusted like 2 weeks later, maybe not even like one week later, I think. So it was really, really mad. And that was a few months ago now, because we had to wait for the slot in their sort of release schedule to get lined up. But it was fantastic. It was like a dream come true, really, especially when you're just a project at home and not really playing out live. And all the stuff we've been doing with studio, we didn't think there would be that level of attention, but they seemed to really rate what we were doing, which was very humbling and fantastic to hear. And thankfully, it seems like it's got some traction so far.
Okay, amazing, amazing. So Now talking about one thing that I also what you mentioned that this band is created with your wife, in this case Sophie.
Yeah.
So, but I spoke a lot of times with a lot of musicians around the world during these 5 6 years. They told me that it's not recommended to do a band with your family because in some point of on some point you will decide to retire the band. Sometimes you perhaps you have fight, and the essence of the band will lose on time. That's why
Mm.
do with friends and other things. So if we put in a supposed case that this will happen in the future, how will you handle this aspect to continue with the band with Sophie or without Sophie, or perhaps one, or perhaps more ideas? Who knows?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd feel like if either one of us ever stopped wanting to do the band, then that would probably just have to be the end of the band, because I think one of the main reasons it works so well is because of our joint vocal approach to it. I think fundamentally when I'm doing the writing of like the guitar parts and things like that, I think mostly what is coming to the fore there is pretty bog standard melodic death metal, to be honest, with a bit of like folk instrumentation over the top. But I think without Soph's vocals providing that counter all the way through, and adding a lot of that ethereal sort of atmospherics and things to it as well, I think it would miss too much of it to warrant continuing as a full project. I mean, we could probably do something else, but you know, on the positive side of things, I don't think there's any sign of us wanting to give it up anytime soon. And to your point, yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubting that sometimes it can be a bit more fractious when it's your spouse, and you know you can have a lot more of a direct argument over some of the content and things like that. But I think in some ways it really works for us as well, because you don't have to worry about band politics. You don't have to worry about compromising to other people's, you know, bits they want to bring to the songs too much, which is all fine. And don't get me wrong, like I've played in bigger bands before, I mean bigger with number of people before, and found, you know, that's still an enjoyable process when you're building the songs as you're jamming, you know, and you're sort of working on, okay, does that work, does that bit work? But you have to compromise because everyone is bringing something different to the table, and so it's a lot harder to have that sort of fairly singular, or in our case like a joint vision of what we want the sound to be like and what we want the elements to do. So you can actually iterate and change your sort of approach, or change your tracks, or change your components of that track much faster, because it's just the two of us. So we can have, you know, we've got Sophie's old acoustic guitar because she started off as a guitarist when she was younger. So we've still got that kicking around downstairs. So we don't really like write on the electrics or anything like that, even though we've got some nice gear, but we write on this acoustic at like the breakfast table, or you know, and sit and get a riff done there, and it can be like, well, how does that sound? And the great thing is, because she's my wife, she'll be very honest and say, no, that sucks. You know, so I can be like, yeah, okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. And you know, we can have that very honest dialogue. And it means you just cut through a lot of the bull in terms of like getting to, right, okay, is this actually going to be a decent track? No, okay, let's scrap it, or let's fix it and start it again. It is more fractious because we can, you know, be that more blunt with each other. But I think probably the only reason we've been able to get out so much material over the past, you know, 3 years is because, you know, we've been able to be that productive with it. So I think as much as it is a challenge sometimes, like I think it has worked really well for us. We also do all our own recording at home, so we don't need to go to a studio for it. So we've got a bit of recording gear in the house, so we can just do all that as a first off. And even if we've got a good idea and the writing seems okay, but then once we've recorded it, we go, actually, you know what, that chorus isn't really working. We can still scrap it at that stage without having invested a load of money into studio time to actually get it recorded in the first place. So there's still a lot of options to, you know, change your mind as you go along, which again really helps, and makes the whole process a lot easier.
Okay. Interesting to know a lot of things. So other kind of details surround the one. I love the live presentation for Han of Kalliach because it's normally when a band grows that when you release your first album, a lot of people say, "Hey, when you will play live?" That's new second albums with prosthetic records now. So and I think you will receive you received more proposals to play live. That's normally because it's the way to promote much better the album and the digital platforms,
Yep,
etc. Or
absolutely.
this kind of interviews. So how will you figure out if some people request a kind of Kalliach to play live. I know that perhaps you are receiving now a lot of proposals.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're totally right. And we got some really kind promoters reaching out to us, even off the back of our last album, saying, "Guys, when are you playing live? Give us a shout. We'll gladly book you in." Which was super awesome and super encouraging and very painful to have to say no to, because one of the, I guess if there's a benefit to us both being married and being able to write so, quickly and effectively at home together, the big challenge is, and it's a really boring one, is we've got little kids. So like to get out to get to practices and stuff like that, we need to get like a childminder in just to go out and do a couple of hours with a broader band. So it's actually like it's a really challenging, difficult aspect to it that you wouldn't have if you were playing with friends, because you would just be going out and say, right, I'm off out for a couple of hours, mind the kids, and that would be fine. So it has been something we've been working up to as well. I think the other big challenge we had on the live front was that a lot of our tracks have a lot of layers to them. So they'll have the guitars, yep, the lead guitar, the rhythm guitar, the bass, the drums, yep. Okay, that's all fine and straightforward. Vocals, yep, fine and straightforward. But then we've got choirs, we've got string sections occasionally, we've got harps occasionally, just different elements that we were trying to work out what the best way would be to get those set up for a live environment. And then also just recruiting some really capable people can always be a challenge. But we have been lucky enough to get a really, really good drummer and a really, really good lead guitarist on board. And we've been practicing with them now for a couple of months. And it's really coming together now. So I'm hoping that by summer we should be able to start playing out live, and we'll see how much we can squeeze in there with the childcare side of things as well.
Okay. Well, other thing or other detail that you mentioned, it's they're more easily to compose music with your wife. We are two, you compose everything. So I think this second album was composed perhaps 1 year or 2 years ago, and you expect about the factory to release or the press plan to release this album according to the delays that they now have on exist on the press plans. Now for the future plans, and perhaps you are right now compose the third album for the Hand of Kalliach, because you have working too since the beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're totally right. I think we've already got maybe about I think we always make more songs than we actually end up using for the album. So I think with Corey Reckon, I think we ended up writing something like 19 odd tracks and then paring that down to the 9 that really sat well together as part of the album. So we've still got some that we've probably abandoned, some that we think we could rework for a future release if it was more in keeping with the themes. And then we've got another pile of bits and pieces and riffs and ideas that we're kind of building up together to get the idea for the next album. So yeah, totally right. We're right back into the writing side of things when we're not, practicing the material for the current stuff, for sure.
Okay. Well, relating the names again, talking about the lyrics, I think for the first two names, including this, I think you are trying to create a concept albums, because the first one is very different, the second one a different, and I think you try to recreate the mythology that you mentioned me in these albums as like a trilogy or perhaps like a concept album, and we will expect a third part like a trilogy of these two.
Yeah, I think that's a really good shout. I'm definitely trying to work with coming up with what we would settle on for our third concept. One thing we had been talking around was, well, we've done Samhain, which is the start of winter. There's another Scottish festival, which is probably a more famous festival in Scotland. It is called Beltane, or Beltane, is the fire festival, and that's usually the end of winter. And there's all sorts of interesting performances and sort of old traditions and customs that go along with that. So that may well be something we can explore a little bit more down the line. I guess one of the challenges is we've tied ourselves so much with the hag god of winter and the watery seas, and our sound is very much tied to a lot of those sort of seascapes and kind of, I don't know, people have described it as being quite oceanic as a sound. So maybe trying to adapt that to a fire festival, I don't know, it might not quite work thematically, so we'll see if we can work it out. But yeah, I think the more we dig into the mythology, when we're looking at bits for inspiration, the more we find, and then the more that we find, the more we come up with, okay, well, hang on, maybe we should do something with ideas X, Y, and Z instead. Like both for this album and for the last album, we've wanted to include some of the sort of monsters and weird creatures from Scottish mythology that might not be so well known. And that's been an absolute blast, like digging into this stuff because they're so dark. Some of them are so horrific, and you can see why they don't really make them into kids' tales these days. But Kieran Crowan, which is the fourth track of, or the new one, Corey Vrecken, that's about a small silver fish that transforms into this whale-eating leviathanic sort of snake serpent beast from the sea. And the basis for the tune and from the chorus, what Soph is singing in Gaelic in the chorus is actually a child's nursery rhyme, which goes 7 herrings a salmon's meal, 7 salmons make a seal's meal, 7 seals make an orca's meal, and 7 orcas make a Kieran Crowan's meal. And that is a kid's nursery rhyme, which is glorious. It didn't have that melody. We added the melody to it. But just coming up with fun things like that has been a real blast to create songs around. So we definitely like to keep exploring that side of things, in addition to some of those broader concepts around, winter and main sort of festivals and events and things.
Okay, okay. We're very close to end this interview. John. And for this aspect, what kind of plans do you have for the band at this moment? Well, we talk about it, probably a new album in the coming weeks, coming months, coming years. And also, you mentioned that you will be well preparing your first live show in Europe and summer festivals, or perhaps after that, perhaps you will do more videos, or who knows what kind of plans you have for this new album.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've nailed it there. I think yeah, live shows is definitely our biggest priority now because it's something we've been promising the supporters and the listeners that we are keen to pursue, and we're working as hard as we can to try and get that to be a reality. At the same time, we are getting the writing going, as I say, for the next album, but I imagine that'll still be at least a year or two off yet. And then also we'll try to produce more on the video side of things. Something we've been discussing is maybe doing like a live stream show from a hall or from a practice room or something like that, just to give people a taste of how it's sort of coming together. That might be a bit of a laugh. And then we've also had a couple of requests for collaborations and things like that, which would be really, really fun to do. That we'd if we can get something working there, that might be a real blast as well. So yeah, plenty on the plate, I guess.
Okay. And as I mentioned, one of the last questions for this interview is that I mentioned one. We will know both and me both that now the metal world is creating a lot of music, technical,
Yeah.
progressive, experimental, jazz, a lot of things happen now, and also the metal trying to survive with a lot of mixtures with different styles, beyond metal, no metal, not metal at all. So, what is your perspective about now the metal are taking a lot of stuff for a different styles, not just heavy metal, thrash metal, death metal, black metal. The metal try to blend it with I don't know, with jazz, with blues, with experimental music, noise. Well, even these kind of styles are in the metal since the 80s, but now it's more present, these kind of mixtures.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good point, a really good question. I mean, I've been a metal fan for like well over like 20 years now. And I cannot get through maybe like 10% of what's released on a week by week basis. I'm lucky if I get like 5 new albums listened to over the course of the week. And I think this week, which our release was a part of, I think there was 70 or something like that. It's just crazy. I mean, it's great. Don't get me wrong. It's awesome that there is so much good, high quality metal being produced out there at the moment, and that there's just so much choice. I think that's a fantastic thing for the scene. But yeah, it's really, really challenging to be able to cut through and actually pick out what you want, and what is worth listening to, and maybe stuff that's less so. I think absolutely I would absolutely attribute some of our success to the fact that we're probably melding a lot more of the sort of different ways of building in folk styles to, what would otherwise be, as I say, a fairly straightforward melodeath sort of bass. Some of my favorite bands out there are doing some fantastic work. One of the other ones on prosthetic, Astroborn, is doing some absolutely top tier melodic death metal that I really love. It's very much in the style of like In Flames and some of those sort of Swedish style old school ones, but like with a really nice twist. But at the same time, I'm looking at those sort of bands and be like, I couldn't play like that. I mean, I could play like that, but it wouldn't be as good as that. And I think there's so many bands that are competing very fiercely, as you say, for those much more easily associatable sort of genres and those historic genres and flavors of music, that it's very, very tough to try and get any traction there. And not that it's all about getting traction, right? I mean, we play the music we play because we really enjoy it, and it gives us a lot of pleasure to write it and play it. But if you're wanting to try and get some traction, and I'd say one of the reasons we have got traction is because it maybe is, as you say, blending in some genres or some ways of blending in different genres that might previously have not been done a huge amount before. I think like one of my favorite bands is Rivers of Nile, for example, and they're doing some fantastic technical death metal, but also throwing in a saxophone, and then you get these really sort of crazy jazz passages kind of floating through some otherwise extremely intense death metal. And on paper, you would look at it and be like, no, 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 what are you doing? Like it's never going to work at all. And the first time I listened to it, I was like, what? This doesn't make any sense at all. And now I've got like all their albums and two of their t-shirts, and I'm like, yes, this is glorious. And I think, as you say, like building in some of these elements that you might not normally expect to see built into more traditional forms of metal and indeed wider music can end up with some really cool and interesting results. And hopefully that's what some of our listeners find with our stuff too.
Okay, okay. Well, John, the sad times arrive at this interview. I hope you enjoy this one like me. This is a great record. Congratulations on it.
Thanks very
And
much.
perhaps do wanna add something to your Latin American fans and obviously Metallitum followers.
Absolutely. Well, look, thanks very much again for having us on, and massive shout out to the South American team because I mean we've had such a surprising amount of support from that part of the world as well. We didn't really think that Scottish wintry melodic death metal with the sort of styles that we had would get traction there, but we've had a really kind response. So a huge thank you from me and Soph for all of that sort of support, and we hope you dig the new tunes.